They said I was ready for the next level, but when they told me what I'd have to do to that innocent child, I knew I couldn't cross that line. That's when everything changed forever. You know, when people see that title about how a man stopped being involved with dark forces, they might think it happened overnight. They might imagine someone just waking up one morning and deciding to walk away from something so deep, so consuming. But friend, let me tell you, it wasn't that simple at all. Not even close. My name is Michael, and I'm going to share something with you that I've carried in my heart for years. Something that changed everything about who I am, about how I see this world, about what real power truly means. This isn't just a story, it's my testimony, and I pray that somehow, in sharing these words, someone out there who might be walking down a similar dark path will find the light they're searching for. See, when you're deep in that world, when you're surrounded by people who promise you power, who tell you that you're special, chosen, that you can have control over your life and others, it becomes like quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. And they don't threaten your life directly. No, sir. They're much smarter than that. They threaten the people you love, your family, your children. That's when you realize you're not dealing with something you can just walk away from. Because you see, to them, if you die, that's almost like a reward. They'd rather see you suffer, see the people you care about suffer. That's how they keep their grip on you. That fear, that constant worry about what might happen to the ones you love if you try to leave. It becomes chains around your soul that feel impossible to break. I remember the exact moment when everything started to shift, though I didn't recognize it at the time. They came to me, the ones higher up in the hierarchy, and they told me I was ready for the next step, ready to move up in rank, to gain more power, more influence. But there was a price. There's always a price in that world. They explained to me about a certain ritual I would need to perform, and when they told me what this ritual involved, when they described what I would have to do to an innocent child, something inside me just froze. I'm not proud of how far I had already fallen, friend, but I thank God that even in my darkest hour, even when my soul was covered in shadows, there was still a tiny spark of humanity left in me that said no, that couldn't cross that line. You have to understand, they tried to make it sound normal. They told me this kind of thing had been happening for centuries, that it was just business as usual. They said thousands of children disappear every year anyway, that there was even a market for what they were after. They talked about something called the deep web, about harvesting fear itself from these little ones, about the rush of terror that comes right at the crucial moment. They said it was valuable, that people paid enormous amounts for it. When they described the procedures to me, the exact steps of what this ritual would involve, I felt sick to my stomach. I knew right then and there that I couldn't do it. I wouldn't be able to go through with something so evil, so completely against everything that makes us human. But I was trapped, you see. When you're that deep in, you can't just say no and walk away. They own you. At the same time all this was happening, there was something else going on in my life that I didn't think much of at the time. I was dating a girl named Sarah. She was a Christian, though not what you'd call a practicing one. To me, she was just entertainment, just another girl to pass the time with. You see, in that dark world I was living in, they had already chosen someone for me. They called her my spiritual twin, my destined partner. So Sarah meant nothing to me, or so I thought. One day, Sarah invited me to go to church with her. I figured, why not? I'll go see what these fools are up to. I was curious about their weaknesses, about how I might be able to use what I learned there. So I went, planning to mock them, to study them like specimens under a microscope. But something happened that I wasn't prepared for. When I walked into that church, there was a group on stage singing worship songs. I think it was something called the Millennial Group, if I remember right. And friend, let me tell you, what I heard wasn't just music. It was real worship, real adoration. This was back when churches still focused on truly worshiping God instead of putting on entertainment shows. What I heard was genuine, pure, from the heart, and it made me furious. I don't mean just annoyed or uncomfortable. I mean a rage so deep, so intense that it felt like fire in my chest. How dare they worship God? How dare they sing praises to someone who I had been taught was evil, who I believed didn't deserve anything but hatred? God was supposed to be the enemy, the cruel one, the one who didn't care about us. That's what I had been told for so long that I believed it completely. But as I stood there listening to those voices lifted in genuine praise, something strange started happening. The anger was still there, burning hot inside me, but then I felt this tingling sensation. It started in my hands and feet and began spreading up through my body. It was like electricity, but not painful. More like a awareness, like waking up from a dream you didn't know you were having. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the ground outside the church building. They told me I had passed out, but it didn't feel like fainting. It felt like something had grabbed hold of me and shaken me awake. I don't remember anything about manifestations or possessions or any of that dramatic stuff you see in movies. But the people there, they said something had definitely happened. They said there was a spiritual presence that had shown itself and then left just as quickly. Later on, after I wrote my book about all this, I had 3 or 4 people reach out to me. They said they had been at that service, that they remembered seeing me there. They confirmed that something supernatural had indeed happened, that there had been some kind of spiritual manifestation that everyone could sense. The church was still under construction at the time. It was the Baptist Church of the Hills, and Pastor David Miller was the man leading it. Good man of God, someone who truly cared about people's souls. Since the building wasn't finished yet, they were holding services in what would eventually become the church parking lot. There was mud everywhere from the construction, and when I fell, I landed right in the middle of it, covered in mud, confused, and deeply shaken by what had just happened. Sarah and I left early. There was no service for us that day, no sermon, no altar call, just mud and questions and a feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the spiritual realm around me. I was furious about the whole thing. How could the entities I served, the powers I had pledged myself to, allow me to be embarrassed like that? How could they let me be humiliated in front of all those people, falling down like some kind of fool? It felt like a betrayal, like they had abandoned me right when I needed their protection most. When I brought this up to the high priest, the one at the very top of our local group, he had an answer ready. He told me I wasn't ready for that kind of spiritual confrontation yet. I needed more power, more preparation. He said they would help me develop the abilities I needed to withstand that kind of attack. And then he started explaining to me exactly how I could gain that power. It all came back to that ritual they wanted me to perform, the one involving the innocent child. He said that was the key to everything, the gateway to the kind of spiritual authority that would protect me from experiences like what had happened at the church. Meanwhile, Sarah was worried about me. She had seen what happened at the church, and she knew it wasn't normal. She told me there was a pastor at her church who specialized in dealing with spiritual oppression, someone who had experience with these kinds of situations. She wanted to set up a meeting between him and me. I agreed, but not for the reason she hoped. I saw it as an opportunity to test my abilities, to see if I could influence this pastor using the dark arts I had been learning. I scheduled a meeting with him at his office on Maple Street, planning to cast a spell that would prevent him from showing up. Now, I need to explain something here. By this time, I wasn't just a follower anymore. I had become what they call a practitioner myself. I had learned to channel the dark forces, to manipulate spiritual energy for specific purposes. So when I decided to work against this pastor, I had tools at my disposal. The spell I cast wasn't meant to harm him directly, just to create some kind of obstacle that would keep him from our meeting. I wanted him to have car trouble, or get sick, or have some family emergency, anything that would prove to me that my abilities were real and that the Christian God was powerless against them. And you know what? Something did happen. The pastor called to reschedule because his son had fallen down the stairs and broken his arm. It was nothing life-threatening, just a household accident, but it meant he couldn't make our appointment. In my mind, this was proof that what I was doing worked. The dark forces were real, and they could influence events in the physical world. So we scheduled a second meeting. But this time, I wasn't content to work alone. I called in other practitioners from our group, asking them to join their power with mine. We were going to create something bigger, something more focused. The goal wasn't just to make him miss the appointment this time. We wanted to actually hurt him, to cause him real pain and suffering. You have to understand, they had been teaching me about spiritual energy, about what they called life force. They said that when someone dies, especially in violent or traumatic circumstances, a tremendous amount of spiritual energy is released. This energy could be harvested and used to increase power, to fuel more elaborate workings. They compared it to an umbilical cord of the spirit, a silver cord that connects every person to the source of their life. The Bible talks about this too, though in different terms. King Solomon wrote about the silver cord that connects us to God. the spiritual lifeline that keeps our souls anchored to our bodies. When that cord is severed, either in God's timing or through evil intervention, tremendous forces are set in motion. Medicine doesn't understand this very well. We know so little about the connection between spirit and flesh, about how consciousness relates to the physical brain. But I've seen what happens when that connection is tampered with. I've seen people who were vibrant and healthy become weak and sick after certain rituals were performed against them. I've also seen the opposite. People who were dying suddenly recover after someone else nearby passed away unexpectedly. The practitioners I worked with, they took pride in their ability to manipulate these forces. They would brag about ancient rituals, about sacrifices performed by civilizations that had learned to harvest spiritual energy on a massive scale. They talked about opening dimensional portals, about bringing entities from other realms into our world. They said it required enormous amounts of life force, massive bloodshed, the simultaneous severing of many silver cords at once. I didn't understand the full implications of what they were telling me at the time, but looking back, I remember them talking about a major working they were planning in America. They said it would happen at the turn of the century, that it would require thousands of people to die all at once in order to tear open the spiritual barriers between worlds. They needed that much blood, that much terror, that much life force all released at the same moment. When September came, when those towers fell and 3,000 people died in a single morning, I couldn't help but think about those conversations. Was that the working they had been preparing for? Was that massive tragedy somehow connected to the spiritual forces I had been serving? I'll never know for certain, but the timing was too precise to ignore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back then, I was focused on this one pastor, this one man who represented everything I had been taught to hate. The second spell we cast was much more elaborate than the first. It wasn't just me working alone, but a whole group of us, all channeling our energy toward the same goal. The pastor didn't show up for our second meeting either. This time, he had been in a car accident. His vehicle was totaled, but somehow he walked away without a scratch. Just shaken up and unable to make our appointment. I was starting to get frustrated. Here I was, working with multiple practitioners, using techniques that were supposed to be incredibly powerful, and this man kept surviving everything we threw at him. I complained to the high priest, telling him that our methods weren't working, that maybe we needed a different approach. His response chilled me to the bone. He said we would handle this pastor personally. Since he had interfered with someone under their protection, since he had challenged their authority by trying to help me, he had made himself a target of the entire organization. They would show me what real power looked like. The ritual they performed was unlike anything I had seen before. This wasn't the stereotype you see in movies, with photographs and candles and dolls stuck with pins. This was high-level spiritual warfare, involving forces and techniques that most people can't even imagine. They called upon entities that had been around since before recorded history, powers that had toppled kingdoms and destroyed civilizations, and they offered a specific price for this pastor's life: 13 souls. 13 people would die if he died, their life force transferred to the entities as payment for their services. That's how the spiritual economy works in that realm. Blood is currency. Death is legal tender. The more innocent the victim, the higher the value. I was certain that this time would be different. How could one man, even a man of God, withstand that kind of concentrated spiritual attack? How could his prayers, his faith, his God protect him against forces that had been perfecting their craft for millennia? I went to our third scheduled meeting feeling triumphant, expecting to hear that he had died overnight, that our working had finally succeeded. I waited for 2 hours. I was about to give up and leave when the door opened and in walked Pastor David, alive, healthy, unharmed, not even a scratch on him. And friend, when I saw him standing there, when I realized that somehow he had survived everything we had thrown at him, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Fear. Real, bone-deep, trembling fear. Now you have to understand, physically speaking, I could have destroyed this man in seconds. I was at the peak of my martial arts training, in the best shape of my life, trained in multiple fighting disciplines. He was just an ordinary middle-aged pastor with no combat experience. But when I looked at him, when I felt the spiritual presence that surrounded him like armor, I knew that if I even tried to touch him, I would collapse just like I had at the church. There was a power protecting him that was so much greater than anything I had ever encountered. A power that made all my dark arts, All my training, all my spiritual authorities looked like children playing with toys. And I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was completely outmatched. So there I was, standing in that little office, looking at Pastor David and feeling more afraid than I had ever been in my life. When he told me he just wanted to pray for me quickly, maybe 5 minutes, I thought to myself, this man's prayers don't have any real power. I was still thinking like someone from that dark world, still believing that what I served was stronger than anything he could call upon. We went upstairs in that little house that served as his counseling center. It was a 2-story building with several small rooms where pastors would meet with people who needed spiritual guidance. When we got to his office, he did something that immediately caught my attention. He locked the door behind us. That's when I really started to panic. I looked around the room and noticed the windows had bars on them. My heart started racing and I said, Pastor, you know what? I've been thinking about this and I don't think I want to pray after all. He just smiled gently and said, that's okay. This will just be quick. Really quick. The last thing I remember clearly is seeing his hand reaching toward me, and then it was like someone turned off the lights in my mind. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I started coming back to awareness, I caught glimpses of what was happening around me. The pastor was still there, speaking in a low, calm voice, but the room looked like a tornado had gone through it. Furniture was overturned, papers were scattered everywhere, and I was hurt. My clothes were torn, I had cuts and bruises, and my whole body ached like I had been in a fight. But Pastor David, he didn't have a scratch on him. Not even his hair was messed up. When I was finally fully conscious, he helped me up and sat me down in a chair. He looked at me with such kindness in his eyes and said, you had something in you. There was a demonic presence, and it's gone now. I was confused and still trying to make sense of what had happened. What do you mean, something in me? That's impossible. I control those forces. They don't control me. He shook his head gently. No, son. That's the illusion they want you to believe. But Jesus has a power that's greater than anything they can offer. God's power is greater than all of it. Would you like to know this, God who has that kind of power? I was hesitant, still trying to process everything that had just happened. But then Pastor David looked directly into my eyes and said something that broke me completely. He said, you've never had peace in your life, have you? And friend, that was it. That was the moment everything crumbled. Because he was absolutely right. I had never known peace. Not for a single day. I had everything I thought I wanted. Power, influence, people who feared me. But I had never had one moment of true peace. I started crying right there in that destroyed office. No, I told him. I don't have peace. I have nightmares every night. I can't sleep properly. There's this constant restlessness inside me, this anger that comes out of nowhere for no reason. I see shadows moving when nothing's there. I hear voices when I'm alone. I don't know if I'm going crazy or if I'm already there. Pastor David put his hand on my shoulder and said, but today, God is going to change your story. And then he did something I will never forget as long as I live. He gave me a hug. Not just any hug, friend, but a hug filled with the love of a father, with warmth and acceptance and pure love. I had never received an embrace like that in my entire life. It was like being wrapped in safety itself. While he was holding me, he whispered in my ear, repeat this prayer after me. Prayer just means talking to God like we're talking now. When God wanted to create light, he spoke it into existence. Now you're going to speak your new life into existence. So I repeated the words he gave me. I don't remember exactly what we said, but I remember meaning every word. When we finished, he hugged me again and kissed my forehead like a father would kiss his child. Today, he said, Jesus is changing your story. I was still sitting there in that torn-up office, looking like I had been through a war. But something incredible was happening inside me. I felt a peace that I don't have words to describe. I felt complete for the first time in my life. I felt loved, accepted, safe. I think in that moment I experienced just a tiny taste of God's presence, and it was more powerful than anything I had ever felt. I couldn't understand it. How could God love me when just minutes before I had hated him? How could he accept me when I had been working against him for so long? What kind of love was this? Why would he care about someone like me? Someone who had nothing good to offer? Pastor David told me that my life was going to be different from that day forward. He gave me another hug and told me I could count on him for anything I needed. Then I went home, feeling happier than I could ever remember being. I was still living with my parents at the time. We didn't have a big house, so we couldn't have large pets, but I had several small animals that I loved dearly. 2 parakeets, a blackbird, a small fish, and a turtle. They were my companions, and I took good care of them. When I got home that evening, one of the high-ranking members from the organization called me. In my book, I gave him the name Marcus, but his real identity doesn't matter. What matters is what he said to me. His voice was cold and threatening. "We warned you that this path isn't for everyone, but you can't just leave. You made a commitment to us. You have obligations to fulfill." He reminded me that I was supposed to participate in that terrible ritual on Saturday. Today was Wednesday, and he made it clear that they expected me to honor my promise. "If you don't do what you agreed to do," he said, "your family will pay the price. They will suffer for your betrayal." In that moment, the only thing I could think to say was, "Marcus, we're wrong. God exists, and He loves you too. He loves all of us." He hung up on me immediately. That night, I slept better than I had slept in years. It was peaceful, restorative sleep, the kind where you wake up feeling truly rested. But when I woke up the next morning, I discovered something that shook me to my core. All of my animals were dead, every single one of them. The parakeets, the blackbird, the fish, the turtle, all of them had died during the night. This same thing happened again later when I was in a serious relationship with a woman named Christina. 3 of her dogs died on the same night, all healthy animals with no signs of illness. That's when I began to understand how this spiritual warfare really works. They drain the life force from innocent creatures as a way of sending a message, as a way of showing their power. I was terrified when I saw my pets that morning, and then the phone rang again. It was Marcus, and this time his voice was even more menacing. "They died, didn't they?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement. He knew exactly what had happened. I couldn't even respond. I was too shocked, too scared. "If you don't fulfill the commitment you made to us," he continued, "your father, your mother, your brothers, they will all die in a ritual sacrifice. Their blood will be payment for your betrayal." I was overcome with fear for my family. I tried to reach Pastor David, but this was before cell phones were common, and he wasn't at the church when I called. In my panic, I grabbed my bicycle and rode as fast as I could to Riverside Park, where there was an army base. In my young, naive mind, I thought that if I stayed close to the military, they would protect me. But when I got too close to the guard post, the sentry politely told me I needed to keep my distance. "Security protocols," he explained. So I sat on the grass nearby, trying to figure out what to do next. I was so stressed and scared that I wasn't thinking clearly. At one point, I made the foolish mistake of trying to relieve myself against the wall of the compound. The guard came over with his weapon and told me in no uncertain terms that I needed to leave immediately or I would be arrested. So there I was, walking away from the only place I thought might offer protection, feeling completely lost and alone. I found a small grassy area not far from the base and just collapsed there as the sun was setting. That's when something beautiful happened. As I lay on my back looking up at the night sky, I really saw the stars for the first time in my life. I mean, really saw them. Each one shining with its own light. Millions of them scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet. And suddenly it hit me like a revelation. God made all of this. Every star that twinkles in the sky, God created it. Every planet, every galaxy, every impossible distance between them. I had never seen the devil create anything. Not one blade of grass, not one flower, not one ray of sunshine. God creates, but evil can only destroy. I started thinking about how perfectly everything works together. Our planet is protected by Jupiter, which acts like a vacuum cleaner, pulling in asteroids and comets that might otherwise crash into Earth. There's an asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter that catches even more space debris. We have an ozone layer that shields us from deadly solar radiation. The moon controls our tides. Everything is perfectly balanced, perfectly designed. Who taught the bees how to make honey? Who gave the ants their incredible organization? Who designed the migration patterns of birds, the hibernation cycles of bears, the way flowers know when to bloom? This isn't random chance. This is the work of a creator who cares about every detail. Lying there under that vast canopy of stars, I prayed my first real prayer. I didn't have anyone to teach me how to do it, so I just talked to God like he was sitting right there next to me. "God," I said, "if you remember me, my name is Michael. I became a Christian yesterday. And then, because I wasn't sure if God knew where I lived, I actually gave him my address. I live at such and such street. Please protect my family, and please take care of me too." Now I understand that there were angels surrounding me that night. The Bible tells us that angels camp around those who fear the Lord, but we have no idea what that really means. One angel killed 185,000 enemy soldiers in a single night. These are beings of incredible power, and when God assigns them to protect someone, nothing can stand against them. I stayed there all night, and when the sun came up, I rode my bike home, not knowing what I would find. But my family was safe. Everyone was there, unharmed, going about their normal morning routines. Later that day, Marcus called again. "You have a commitment to us," he said. "We're going to come get you." "I'm not going to do it," I told him. "I can't do what you're asking me to do." "Then your family will pay the price." I asked if I could speak to Robert, the man who had been like a father figure to me in the organization. Robert was the high priest, the one at the very top of our local group, and he had always treated me with kindness and protection. He had seemed to genuinely care about me, in his own twisted way. When I got Robert on the phone, I made him a promise. "Robert, I swear to you that I will never reveal any of the secrets I learned. I won't teach anyone the techniques you taught me. I won't tell anyone where you meet or who is involved. I won't expose any of you. Just let me live my life in peace." There was a long pause, and then he said, "Keep your mouth shut and we'll leave you alone." But before we hung up, I had to ask him about something that had been haunting me. I had seen the child they were planning to use in that Saturday ritual. She was only 9 years old. Her parents had given her to the organization in exchange for power and influence. They had arranged for another couple to raise her, cutting all emotional ties, making it easier to use her when the time came. It's disturbing how this kind of thing shows up in popular culture. I watched a movie recently called Children of Privilege that depicted almost exactly what I had witnessed. The film shows how certain groups manipulate children, how they use psychological drugs and experimental medications to control people's minds. After World War II, a pharmaceutical company was founded in New York by 2 German scientists who had perfected their techniques during the war. They had used prisoners as test subjects, learning how to manipulate brain chemistry, how to create drugs that would make soldiers fearless, tireless, unable to feel pain. They used stimulants that were like methamphetamines, steroids that made people unnaturally strong, chemicals that enhanced focus and eliminated the need for sleep. Many of those soldiers paid a terrible price later. Their hearts gave out, their minds broke down, their bodies demanded payment for what had been done to them. But during the war, they seemed unstoppable. That's how the French forces knew something was wrong when they saw German soldiers running impossible distances without getting tired. It's strange, but ever since I was around 18 or 19 years old, I've never gotten sick. Not once. No colds, no flu, no infections. I don't know if it's genetics or if something was done to me during my time with that group, or if it's just God's protection. But I've often wondered about it, especially when my wife was expecting our first child. Was there something in my system that might affect the baby? I published my story partly because I wanted people to know what really goes on in these secret organizations, but also because I was hoping someone with medical knowledge might be able to explain some of the things that happened to me. The truth is, friend, once you've been that deep in spiritual darkness, it changes you in ways you might not even realize. Your body, your mind, your spirit, they all bear the marks of what you've been through. But I've learned that God's healing power is greater than any damage that can be done. His love is stronger than any curse, His light brighter than any shadow. That night when I made my first real prayer under the stars, when I asked God to protect my family and to help me find my way, He heard me. He answered, and He's been answering ever since, one day at a time, one prayer at a time, one small miracle at a time. I didn't know it then, but that conversation with Robert was the beginning of my real freedom. Yes, I had to live with the fear that they might come back, that they might decide I knew too much or posed too great a threat. But I also had something I had never had before. I had hope. I had peace. I had a God who loved me just as I was, who wanted to give me a new life, a clean start, a reason to wake up every morning with joy instead of dread. And that little girl, I never stopped praying for her. I never stopped hoping that somehow, someway, God would rescue her from the darkness I had been pulled out of. Because if he could save someone like me, someone who had gone as far down that road as it's possible to go, then he could save anyone. He could save everyone. That's the message I want to leave you with today, friend. No matter how dark your path has been, no matter how far you think you've fallen, no matter what you've done or what's been done to you, God's love is bigger. His mercy is deeper. His power is greater. And if you're ready to let him change your story, he's ready to begin that work right now, right where you are. All you have to do is what I did that night under the stars. Just talk to him. Tell him where you are. Tell him what you need. Tell him you're ready for something different. He's listening. He's been waiting. And he's ready to show you what real power, real love, real peace actually looks like. After that conversation with Robert, something beautiful happened. Silence. For nearly 2 years, they left me alone completely. No phone calls, no threats, no mysterious deaths of small animals around me. It was like they had simply erased me from their world, and I was more grateful for that silence than I had ever been for anything in my life. But friend, let me tell you, starting over isn't as simple as people might think. When you walk away from that kind of life, you don't just lose the darkness, you lose everything. I lost my job almost immediately. Word got around somehow. People started asking questions, and before I knew it, I was unemployed with no prospects and no idea how to support myself. That's when I started teaching martial arts classes to make ends meet. Just a few students here and there, enough to pay for basic necessities. It wasn't much money, but it was honest work, and for the first time in years, I could sleep at night knowing that I hadn't hurt anyone that day. That peace was worth more than all the power and influence I had given up. During this quiet period in my life, I lost touch with Pastor David completely. I tried calling the church several times, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. It was like he had simply vanished. I often wondered if something had happened to him because of our encounter, if the forces I had been connected to had somehow retaliated against him. That thought haunted me for a long time, but I held on to the hope that God was protecting him just like he had protected him during our spiritual battle. It was during this time that something interesting happened right in my neighborhood. A new church opened up literally on my street just a few blocks from my parents' house. I could walk there in 5 minutes. I took this as a sign from God that he was making sure I had somewhere to go, somewhere to grow in this new faith that was still so fragile and uncertain. The pastor there was a kind man who welcomed me warmly, even though I'm sure I must have seemed like an odd addition to their congregation. I was still learning how to act like a normal person, still discovering what it meant to live without constantly looking over my shoulder, still figuring out how to relate to people who had never experienced the kind of darkness I was coming from. It was at this little neighborhood church that I met Christina. She was a medical student, brilliant and dedicated, with a heart for helping people that reminded me every day what genuine goodness looked like. She was different from anyone I had ever known, not because she was perfect, but because she was real, authentic. What you saw was exactly what you got, and what you got was someone who truly cared about making the world a better place. Christina had no idea about my background when we first started talking. To her, I was just this guy who taught martial arts and seemed to have an unusual interest in spiritual things. We would have long conversations after church services, discussions about faith and purpose and what it meant to follow God in a world that often seems to be falling apart. As our friendship grew into something deeper, I knew I would eventually have to tell her the truth about my past. But how do you explain to someone you're falling in love with that you used to serve the very forces of evil they pray against every night? How do you describe experiences that sound like something out of a horror movie to someone who has lived their entire life in the light? I wrestled with this question for months. Part of me wanted to keep that chapter of my life buried forever, to pretend it had never happened and just focus on building something new. But I knew that wasn't fair to Christina, and it wasn't honest. If we were going to have a real relationship, she deserved to know who I really was and where I had come from. During this internal struggle, I started writing, not with any intention of publishing anything, but just as a way to process everything I had been through. I found that putting my experiences into words helped me understand them better, helped me see how God had been working even in the darkest moments of my life. What started as personal journaling eventually became something more structured. I began crafting a fictional story, A trilogy, actually, that would allow me to explore the spiritual realities I had experienced without revealing specific details that might be dangerous or harmful. In this story, I created a character who was born into a satanic family, someone who had been raised in that world from birth and knew no other way of life. The main character in my story was what you might call a legitimate practitioner of dark arts, someone who had been trained from childhood in the deepest secrets of that realm. But then he meets a young woman who represents everything he has been taught to despise. She's a genuine believer, not the kind of person who just goes to church on Sundays, but someone who truly lives her faith every day. In my fictional version, I created ways for these two characters to connect, to have real conversations about their opposing worldviews. I showed how they challenged each other, how their relationship forced both of them to examine what they really believed and why. It became a story about how love can bridge seemingly impossible gaps, how truth can penetrate even the deepest darkness. Writing this trilogy was therapeutic for me, but it also served another purpose. I was able to describe certain realities about spiritual warfare and occult practices without providing a how-to manual for people who might be tempted to experiment with such things. As I like to tell people, I was showing them a car but removing the key and draining the gas tank. They could see what the vehicle looked like, but they couldn't take it for a drive. Still, I was careful to include enough authentic details that people who had experienced similar things would recognize the truth in what I was writing. I received letters from readers who said they had been involved in occult practices and that my books had helped them understand they weren't alone, that there was a way out. But I also received some letters that concerned me. A few people wrote to tell me that they had used information from my books to attempt their own rituals and ceremonies, even though I had been careful not to include complete instructions. Apparently, some readers were able to fill in the gaps using other sources. This possibility haunted me, especially when Christina and I got married and started talking about having children. What if my decision to write about these experiences had somehow opened a door for retaliation? What if the forces I had escaped decided that I had violated my promise to Robert to keep silent about what I had learned? When Christina became pregnant with our first child, these fears intensified. Every doctor's appointment, every ultrasound, every test brought both excitement and anxiety. I found myself praying constantly, not just for the health of our baby, but for protection from any consequences of my past that might affect my family. Tragically, our first pregnancy ended in loss. Christina miscarried early in the second trimester, and we were both devastated. In my darkest moments, I wondered if this was punishment for my decision to write about my experiences. Had I somehow brought this pain upon us by revealing too much about the world I had left behind? I remember the night after we lost our baby, lying awake and wrestling with God about why this had happened. I prayed through tears, telling him that if this was somehow connected to my past, if there were consequences I needed to face, then I accepted his will. But I also begged him to show me what my purpose was in all of this. Why had he rescued me from that darkness? Why had he allowed me to experience his love and grace? What was I supposed to do with this new life he had given me? It was during this time of grief and questioning that I began to understand something important about the nature of spiritual warfare. The enemy doesn't just attack us directly, he also attacks the people we love, the dreams we hold dear, the future we're trying to build. He knows that sometimes the most effective way to hurt someone is to hurt the people they care about most. But I also began to understand that God's purposes are bigger than our immediate circumstances. Romans 8:28 tells us that all things work together for good for those who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. The word all in that verse doesn't exclude anything. It doesn't say most things or the good things. It says all things, even the painful things, even the things that break our hearts and challenge our faith. As Christina and I grieved together, our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't expected. She never blamed me for our loss, never suggested that my past might have contributed to what happened. Instead, she held on to faith with a strength that inspired me every day. She reminded me that God's love is bigger than any curse, stronger than any spiritual attack, more enduring than any darkness we might face. Slowly, we began to heal. We continued attending the little church in our neighborhood, continued building relationships with people who accepted us just as we were. Christina finished her medical degree, and I expanded my martial arts instruction, eventually opening a small studio where I could teach not just fighting techniques, but also principles of discipline, respect, and self-control. About 2 years after our loss, Christina became pregnant again. This time, we approached the pregnancy with a mixture of hope and caution, faith and fear. But as the months passed and everything proceeded normally, we began to believe that God was blessing us with the family we had dreamed of. Our son was born healthy and perfect, a beautiful reminder that God's plans for us are good, even when we can't understand them in the moment. Holding him for the first time, I was overwhelmed with gratitude for how far I had come, for the new life God had given me, for the family He was allowing me to build. It was around this time that I began to feel a new calling, a sense that my experiences, as painful as they had been, were meant to be used for something greater than my own healing. I started speaking at churches, sharing my testimony with people who were struggling with various forms of spiritual oppression. I discovered that my story had the power to bring hope to people who felt trapped in their own darkness. Some of the people who reached out to me were involved in occult practices themselves. Others were family members of people caught up in such things. Still others were just curious about the spiritual realm and wanted to understand better how to protect themselves and their loved ones. Each conversation reminded me that the battle between light and darkness is real, ongoing, and affects more people than most of us realize. But it also reminded me that God's rescue mission is real too. He is actively working to pull people out of every kind of bondage, to heal every kind of wound, to restore every broken relationship. As our son grew, Christina and I made sure to raise him with a clear understanding of both the reality of spiritual warfare and the power of God's protection. We didn't want to frighten him unnecessarily, but we also didn't want him to be naive about the forces that exist in this world. We taught him to pray, to trust in God's love, and to recognize the difference between light and darkness in all its forms. Looking back now, I can see how God was preparing me for the ministry He had planned for my life. Every experience, even the darkest ones, had taught me something valuable about His character, His power, and His love. The years of silence after my conversion weren't wasted years. They were preparation years, foundation building years, healing years. The little church where Christina and I met became our spiritual home for many years. The pastor there, Pastor Williams, became a mentor and friend who helped me understand not just what I had been saved from, but what I had been saved for. He encouraged me to develop my gifts, to share my story more widely, and to trust that God would use my experiences to help others find freedom. It was Pastor Williams who first suggested that I consider writing a book about my actual experiences, not fiction this time, but a straightforward testimony of what God had done in my life. The idea terrified me at first. Writing fiction felt safe because I could hide behind the characters and plot devices. But writing the truth, using my real name, sharing specific details about people and events, that felt dangerous. But as I prayed about it, I began to sense that this was exactly what God was calling me to do. There were too many people trapped in the same darkness I had escaped from. There were too many families suffering because someone they loved had been deceived by promises of power and knowledge. There were too many young people being recruited into occult practices because they didn't understand what they were really getting involved in. So I began to write my testimony, the real story this time, holding nothing back except the specific technical details that might be used to harm others. I wrote about the recruitment process, about the gradual seduction that led me deeper and deeper into darkness. I wrote about the hierarchy, the rituals, the fear and control that kept people trapped. But most importantly, I wrote about the love and power of God that proved stronger than all of it. The decision to publish my testimony wasn't easy, and it didn't come without consequences. Some people in our church weren't comfortable with the detailed descriptions of occult practices. Some family members worried about possible retaliation. Some friends thought I was being unnecessarily dramatic or sensational. But I also received letters from people all over the world who thanked me for having the courage to tell the truth. Former practitioners wrote to tell me that my book had helped them understand that freedom was possible. Parents wrote to thank me for helping them recognize warning signs in their children's behavior. Pastors wrote to say that my testimony had equipped them to minister more effectively to people dealing with spiritual oppression. One letter that particularly moved me came from a woman whose teenage daughter had been recruited into a group very similar to the one I had been involved with. She said that reading my book had given her the courage to confront the situation directly and to fight for her daughter's freedom using spiritual weapons instead of just parental authority. These responses confirmed for me that God had indeed called me to share my story publicly. Yes, it was risky. Yes, it made me vulnerable. Yes, it opened old wounds and forced me to relive experiences I would rather forget. But it was also saving lives, protecting families, and exposing darkness that thrives in secrecy. As I write this now, years later, I can see how every part of my journey has contributed to the ministry God has given me. The darkness taught me to appreciate the light. The bondage taught me to value freedom. The fear taught me to trust in God's protection. The lies taught me to love the truth. I'm not the same person who walked into that church and collapsed in the mud all those years ago. God has healed my mind, restored my soul, and given me a purpose that brings meaning to every day. But I also haven't forgotten where I came from, or how far I had fallen before God's grace caught me. That's why I continue to share my story, despite the risks and discomfort. Because somewhere out there, someone is trapped in the same darkness I escaped from. Someone is believing the same lies I believed, making the same mistakes I made, walking down the same destructive path I walked. And I want them to know that no matter how far they've gone, no matter how deeply they're involved, no matter how impossible escape might seem, God's love is stronger, His power is greater, His grace is sufficient. And if He could rescue someone like me, He can rescue anyone. You know, friend, when God starts working in your life, He doesn't just change your present circumstances. He gives you a vision for your future that's bigger than anything you could have imagined for yourself. That's exactly what happened to me in the years following my encounter with Pastor David and my growing relationship with Christina. After we were married and settled into our new life together, I felt this burning inside me to share what God had done. Not just in conversations with friends at church, but in a way that could reach people I might never meet. People who were walking in the same darkness I had escaped from. That's when I knew God was calling me to write. Now, I need to tell you something about my relationship with coffee that might seem silly, but it became an important part of my writing routine. I've always been a coffee drinker, you see. Can't start the day without it. It's one of those simple pleasures that reminds me how good God is in even the smallest details of life. But here's the funny thing. Coffee affects my stomach in ways that, well, let's just say I have to plan my schedule carefully when I drink it. This became particularly important when I started speaking at churches and conferences. If I had a 2-hour speaking engagement, I'd have to skip my morning coffee because I knew exactly what would happen about 30 minutes after drinking it. It was embarrassing at first, but Christina would laugh and say that even my digestive system was part of God's plan to keep me humble. But when I was writing, oh friend, that was different. I could drink my coffee and settle in at my little desk in our spare bedroom, and the words would just flow. It was like God was using even that simple ritual to prepare my mind and heart for the work He wanted me to do. The first book I decided to write wasn't actually about my testimony directly. Instead, I felt led to create what would eventually become a 4-book series I called The Dimitri Chronicles. These were fictional stories, but they were based on very real spiritual truths I had learned through my experiences. The main character in these books was someone born into a generational pattern of dark spiritual practices, raised from childhood to understand and operate in that realm. But then he encounters a young woman whose faith challenges everything he's been taught to believe. Their relationship becomes a battleground between light and darkness, not just in the spiritual realm, but in the very practical matter of how two people with completely opposite worldviews can find common ground. Writing this series was both therapeutic and challenging for me. I had to revisit memories and experiences I would have preferred to forget, but I also got to explore what redemption looks like when God gets hold of a life that seems completely lost. Through fiction, I could show readers the reality of spiritual warfare without providing a manual for dangerous practices. The writing process took me nearly 3 years to complete all 4 books. Christina would often find me at my desk late at night, typing away on our old computer, completely absorbed in bringing these characters to life. She understood that this wasn't just creative expression for me. It was ministry, it was healing, it was God's way of taking the most painful parts of my past and transforming them into something that could help others. But even as I was writing fiction, I knew that eventually I would need to tell my real story. The fictional approach allowed me to explore themes and ideas safely, but there were people out there who needed to hear that what I was describing wasn't just imagination, it was testimony. They needed to know that if God could rescue the character in my books, He could rescue them too, because he had rescued me. The challenge was finding a publisher who would take a risk on such controversial subject matter. This was back in 1999, and the Christian publishing world was much more conservative than it is today. Topics like occult involvement, spiritual warfare, and demonic oppression were often considered too sensational or too risky for mainstream Christian audiences. I'll never forget the day I finally decided to step out in faith and approach a publisher with my real testimony. I had written what would become my first nonfiction book, Son of Fire, which told my actual story without the protective layer of fiction. It was raw, honest, and more vulnerable than anything I had ever written. The publisher I approached was a small Christian press run by a pastor who understood that sometimes the most important stories are the ones that make people uncomfortable. When I sat down with him to discuss the project, I could see the wheels turning in his mind. He knew this book could either be a powerful tool for ministry or a source of significant controversy. "Michael," he said after reading through my manuscript, "I believe God wants this story told, but I also think you need to understand what you're getting into. Once this book is published, your life will never be private again. People will either embrace you as a messenger of hope or attack you as someone who's glorifying darkness. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Christina, about our unborn children, about the quiet life we had been building together. Was I ready to risk all of that for the sake of sharing my testimony? But then I remembered that 9-year-old girl I had seen in that organization, and all the other children and young people who were being recruited every day into the same darkness I had escaped from. How could I stay silent when my story might be the key to their freedom? "I'm ready," I told him. "God didn't rescue me just so I could live a comfortable life. He rescued me so I could help rescue others." The publisher agreed to work with me, but there was one major obstacle: money. As a small operation, he didn't have the capital to fund the printing costs up front. The minimum print run for a book like mine would be 2,000 copies, and the cost was substantial, especially for someone like me who was still teaching martial arts classes to make ends meet. That's when I learned something beautiful about the body of Christ. When God gives you a vision, He also provides the resources to fulfill it, often through the generosity of people who believe in what He's doing through you. One person offered to handle the book design and layout as their contribution. Another donated the artwork for the cover. Someone else offered to help with editing and proofreading, but we still needed money for the actual printing. I remember praying about this with Christina, asking God to provide a way or to close the door if this wasn't His will. The next Sunday at church, a member of our congregation approached me after service. "Michael," he said, "I've been praying about your book project and I feel like God wants me to help. I can't cover all the costs, but I can give you enough for a down payment to get the printing started." I was amazed, not just by his generosity, but by the fact that God had spoken to him about something I had only shared with a few close friends. It was confirmation that this project was truly from Him, and that He would provide everything needed to see it through. When I went back to the printer with the down payment, the owner looked at me with curiosity. "You know," he said, "I've been in this business for 20 years and I've never had someone come in here with such confidence about a book project when they clearly don't have all the money up front. What makes you so sure this is going to work?" I couldn't help but smile. "Sir, I've seen God do impossible things in my life. This book isn't just my story, it's His story. And if He wants it told, He'll make sure it reaches the people who need to read it." The printer studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You know what? I believe you. We'll print your books, and you can pay us the balance 30 days after delivery. I don't usually do business this way, but something tells me this is going to be different." And it was different, friend. More different than any of us could have imagined. When Son of Fire was finally published, I had no idea what to expect. I started by selling copies at the churches and conferences where I was speaking, carrying boxes of books in the trunk of my car and setting up little displays wherever people would let me. Christina would help me organize orders and handle shipping for the people who wanted copies mailed to them. But then something amazing started happening. People who read the book began recommending it to others. Pastors started ordering copies for their congregations. Christian bookstores began asking about carrying it. Word was spreading, not through expensive marketing campaigns, but through the simple power of testimony shared from one heart to another. I remember the first time I walked into a major Christian bookstore and saw my book on the shelf. It was sitting right there between titles by well-known authors, looking like it belonged there. I stood in that aisle for several minutes, just staring at it, and thanking God for how far He had brought me. But the real confirmation that God was using this book came through the letters I started receiving from readers. People wrote to tell me that my story had helped them understand their own experiences with spiritual oppression. Parents contacted me to say that the book had helped them recognize warning signs in their teenagers' behavior. Former practitioners of various occult disciplines reached out to share their own stories and to thank me for having the courage to speak openly about these realities. One letter that particularly moved me came from a young man in his 20s who had been involved in the same type of organization I had escaped from. He wrote, "I thought I was the only one who had experienced these things. I thought no one would believe me if I tried to explain what I had been through. Your book showed me that I'm not alone and that freedom is possible. I'm working with a pastor now to break free from the commitments I made, and for the first time in years, I have hope." Messages like that one reminded me why God had called me to write in the first place. This wasn't about building a career as an author or gaining recognition for my literary skills. This was about spiritual warfare, about rescuing people from darkness, about showing them that God's love is stronger than any evil they might have encountered. As the success of Son of Fire grew, I found myself in an interesting position. Christian media outlets wanted to interview me about my experiences. Church conferences invited me to speak about spiritual warfare and deliverance ministry. People began recognizing me in public places and approaching me to share their own stories or ask for advice. Sometimes it was overwhelming. Christina and I would be out for a simple dinner, and someone would recognize me from my book photo and want to sit down at our table to discuss their family's struggles with occult involvement. While I was grateful for the opportunities to help people, I also had to learn how to maintain healthy boundaries and protect our private life together. There were also challenges I hadn't expected. Some critics accused me of sensationalizing spiritual warfare or giving too much attention to demonic activity. Others questioned whether my experiences were real or suggested that I was somehow glorifying the darkness I claimed to have escaped from. These criticisms hurt, especially when they came from fellow Christians who should have understood the importance of testimony in the life of faith. But Christina reminded me that even Jesus faced criticism from religious leaders who didn't like his methods or his message. If they criticized him, she would say, they're certainly going to criticize us. But that doesn't mean we stop doing what God has called us to do. The success of my first testimony also opened doors for me to write more extensively about spiritual warfare, practical Christianity, and the process of healing and restoration after traumatic experiences. Over the next several years, I published more books, each one exploring different aspects of what it means to live as someone who has been rescued from extreme darkness and called into God's marvelous light. But it wasn't just about the writing. The books became a platform for a broader ministry of speaking, counseling, and equipping other believers to understand and engage in spiritual warfare. I began traveling to churches and conferences across the country, sharing not just my testimony, but practical teaching about how Christians can protect themselves and their families from spiritual attack. One of the most rewarding aspects of this ministry was seeing how God used my story to equip pastors and church leaders who were encountering situations they didn't understand. Many pastors had received little or no training in dealing with occult involvement, spiritual oppression, or ritual abuse. My books and speaking engagements became resources that helped them minister more effectively to people dealing with these complex issues. I also began receiving invitations to speak at secular venues, universities, community centers, even law enforcement training seminars. Police officers and social workers were encountering ritual abuse cases and cult-related crimes, and they needed to understand the mindset and methods of the groups they were investigating. My background gave me insights that could help them protect victims and build stronger cases against perpetrators. This broader platform also brought new responsibilities and new dangers. Speaking openly about organized occult activity meant potentially exposing groups that preferred to operate in secrecy. I received threats, both explicit and implied, warning me to stop sharing information that could compromise their operations. Christina and I had to make some difficult decisions about security and privacy. We moved to a new address that wasn't publicly listed. We changed our phone number and used a post office box for mail. We varied our routines and avoided establishing predictable patterns that might make us vulnerable to retaliation. But we also experienced God's protection in ways that strengthened our faith and confirmed that we were walking in His will. There were times when threats were made against us that simply didn't materialize. Incidents that should have resulted in harm somehow turned into opportunities for testimony. People who approached us with hostile intentions often left our encounters with changed hearts and new understanding. One particularly memorable incident occurred during a speaking engagement at a large church in the Midwest. I was about halfway through my presentation when a man in the audience stood up and began shouting accusations at me, claiming that I was a fraud and that my story was fabricated. Security moved to escort him out, but I asked them to wait. Instead of having him removed, I invited him to come forward and share his concerns with everyone. It turned out that he had been involved in occult practices himself and was angry that someone was publicly exposing information he thought should remain secret. Through a conversation that lasted nearly an hour, with the entire congregation watching, he eventually broke down and admitted that he wanted the same freedom I had found, but didn't know how to escape from his own involvement. That night, he prayed with the pastor and began his own journey toward freedom. Later, he became one of the most effective advocates for cult awareness in his community. What could have been a disruptive confrontation became a powerful demonstration of God's redemptive power. As my ministry continued to grow, I realized that God was preparing me for something even bigger than I had originally envisioned. The books, the speaking engagements, the counseling sessions, they were all building toward a larger calling to help the church understand and engage with the spiritual realities of our time. We live in an age when occult practices are increasingly mainstream, when spiritual warfare is often ignored or misunderstood, when many Christians feel unprepared to deal with the very real demonic activity happening around them. God had given me a unique perspective on these issues, not through academic study but through personal experience, and He was calling me to use that perspective to equip His people for the battles they were facing. This calling would eventually lead to the establishment of a ministry organization focused specifically on cult awareness, spiritual warfare training, and support for people recovering from occult involvement. But that's a story for later. For now, what I want you to understand is how God took the most shameful and painful parts of my past and transformed them into tools for ministry that have reached thousands of people around the world. That's the power of redemption, friend. That's what God specializes in. Taking broken people and broken situations and creating something beautiful from the pieces. My story isn't unique in that sense. Every person who has experienced God's salvation has their own testimony of transformation, their own example of how He can take a wasted life and turn it into something meaningful and productive. But I do think my story illustrates something important about the nature of spiritual warfare and the reality of God's power over darkness. No matter how deep someone has gone into evil, no matter how thoroughly they've been deceived or how completely they've given themselves over to destructive forces, God's love is deeper still. His power is greater, His grace is sufficient, and if you're reading this today feeling like you've gone too far, like you've done things that put you beyond the reach of God's forgiveness, I want you to know that you're wrong. I was wrong when I believed those same lies about myself. God's arms are wide enough to embrace anyone who comes to Him in genuine repentance, no matter what they've done or where they've been. That's the message I've spent years sharing through books, through speaking, through counseling, and through personal conversations. It's the message God rescued me to deliver, and it's the message He's calling every believer to share with a world that desperately needs to hear it. In the end, that's what this whole journey has been about. Not just my personal freedom, but the freedom of everyone who remains trapped in the darkness I escaped from. God didn't rescue me just for my own sake. He rescued me to be part of His rescue mission for others. And friend, if you've experienced His salvation in your own life, that same calling is on you too. You know, friend, life has a way of testing your faith even after God has done miraculous things in your life. The success of my books and the growing ministry didn't shield Christina and me from the ordinary struggles that every married couple faces. In fact, sometimes I think God allows those struggles specifically to keep us humble and dependent on Him. Shortly after we were married, Christina went through one of the most difficult periods of her life. Her father passed away suddenly in his sleep, which was devastating enough. But then family members, in their grief and shock, said things they probably didn't mean. Someone actually said to her, "What good is it having a doctor in the family if you couldn't even save your own father?" Those words hit Christina like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had graduated from the University of São Paulo Medical School, one of the most prestigious in the country. She had specialized in infectious diseases and was working at the Hospital das Clínicas, learning advanced medicine through what they call osmosis. Just being around so many brilliant doctors and difficult cases that you absorb knowledge almost by breathing the air in that place. But that thoughtless comment from a grieving family member shattered her confidence completely. She came home that day and told me, "Michael, I'm not worthy to practice medicine. I couldn't save my own father. How can I be trusted with other people's lives?" It broke my heart to see this brilliant, compassionate woman doubt herself so completely. She had studied for 6 years to become a doctor, then additional years specializing in infectious diseases. She was working in one of the most demanding medical environments in Brazil, where the healthcare system operates under what can only be described as warlike conditions. The workload, the lack of resources, the constant pressure, it's overwhelming even for the most dedicated professionals. But grief and guilt don't listen to logic. Christina stopped practicing medicine entirely. She just couldn't bring herself to trust her abilities anymore, convinced that she was somehow a failure as a doctor because she couldn't prevent her father's natural death. This created additional challenges for us financially. I had been laid off from my job at Sears, the department store that used to be where the West Plaza shopping center is now. It's funny how things change. That whole area where I used to work selling merchandise has been completely transformed. My father actually worked at Mappin, another department store from that era, selling televisions and electronics. Those were simpler times in some ways. You could buy almost anything in those stores: clothes, appliances, even firearms. I remember seeing rifles and handguns displayed right there in the sporting goods section. You could purchase a weapon as easily as buying a television. It's very different now, with all the regulations and bureaucracy involved in legal gun ownership. Speaking of which, I've recently been going through the process of obtaining my shooting permit and firearms registration. It's been an education in patience, let me tell you. People sometimes think it's easy to buy guns legally in Brazil, but that's not true at all. The process takes over a year and involves multiple stages of approval. First, you have to take a basic shooting course and pass both written and practical tests. Then you apply for your CAC registration. That's collector, shooter, and hunter, which requires psychological evaluation, background checks, and months of waiting for military approval. Once you finally get your registration certificate, you can apply to purchase a specific weapon, which requires another approval process that can take several more months. Even after you've paid for your gun and received the receipt, you still can't take it home until you get your transport permit, which requires yet another approval process. Right now, my revolver is sitting in a safe at the shooting club because I'm still waiting for the final paperwork to bring it home. The whole process from start to finish typically takes about 18 months. I chose a .357 Magnum revolver, which is quite powerful, but suits my purposes for sport shooting and, if necessary, home protection. The recoil takes some getting used to, but with practice you develop the technique to handle it effectively. I find target shooting to be relaxing and stress-relieving, which is important given the nature of my ministry work. The shooting hobby connects to my long history with martial arts, which has been a constant thread throughout my life, even during my darkest years. I achieved master level in Kung Fu, specifically in the Wing Chun style, which is the same foundation that Bruce Lee started with before he developed his own Jeet Kune Do system. Wing Chun has an interesting history. It was created by a Buddhist nun named Ng Mui as a way for smaller, weaker people to defend themselves against larger, stronger opponents. The style focuses on efficiency and directness rather than flashy movements. It's sometimes compared to Krav Maga in its practical, no-nonsense approach to self-defense. In traditional Chinese martial arts philosophy, earning a black belt doesn't make you a master automatically. You become a professor first, qualified to teach the style. You only earn the title of master after one of your students achieves black belt level and passes evaluation by a committee of existing masters. The title recognizes not just your personal skill, but your ability to transmit the art without corrupting its original form. I specialized in several weapons as well, particularly the nunchaku, which most people know from Bruce Lee movies. It's actually a Japanese farming tool that was adapted as a weapon in Okinawa and then refined by Chinese martial artists. I also trained with the tonfa and butterfly knives, traditional weapons of the Wing Chun system. It's been about 5 years since I've trained seriously, so I'm not in the same physical condition I once was. But muscle memory is a remarkable thing. If I needed to defend myself or my family today, I would focus on ending any confrontation as quickly as possible. Wing Chun teaches you to target vital points: eyes, throat, floating ribs, knees, groin, places where even a smaller person can inflict enough damage to stop an attacker immediately. The goal isn't to engage in a prolonged fight, but to disable your opponent quickly and escape. At my age and current fitness level, I couldn't sustain a lengthy physical confrontation anyway. It would have to be decisive and immediate. I mention my martial arts background because it's relevant to something important I want to discuss with you. Throughout my journey, from my involvement in dark spiritual practices to my conversion and subsequent ministry, I've always believed in the importance of being prepared to protect yourself and your loved ones. The world we live in isn't always safe, and there are people out there who mean harm to others. Sometimes that harm is physical, sometimes it's spiritual, sometimes it's both. As Christians, we're called to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. That means understanding the realities of the world we live in while maintaining our commitment to peace and righteousness. My martial arts training taught me discipline, respect, and the proper use of force. It gave me confidence and the ability to remain calm under pressure. These skills served me well during my years in the occult, and they've continued to serve me in ministry. When you're dealing with people involved in dangerous spiritual practices, when you're confronting forces of darkness, it helps to know that you can handle yourself physically if necessary. But more importantly, my martial arts background has taught me about the spiritual dimensions of conflict. Traditional martial arts aren't just about fighting techniques. They're about developing inner strength, mental discipline, and spiritual awareness. These principles translate directly to spiritual warfare and the Christian life. The patience required to master a complex fighting system is the same patience needed to grow in faith and character. The discipline necessary to practice forms and techniques repeatedly is the same discipline required for prayer and Bible study. The respect for your opponents that martial arts teaches parallels the love we're supposed to have for our enemies. As I reflect on my entire journey from darkness to light, from spiritual bondage to freedom in Christ, from silence to public ministry, I'm amazed at how God has used every experience, even the painful ones, to prepare me for the work He's called me to do. The skills I learned in the occult gave me insight into how spiritual deception operates. The trauma I experienced taught me compassion for others going through similar struggles. The martial arts training gave me confidence and discipline. The writing and speaking experiences taught me how to communicate complex spiritual truths in ways people can understand. Even the financial struggles Christina and I faced taught us to depend on God's provision rather than our own abilities. When both of us were unemployed, when her medical career was derailed by grief and self-doubt, when my book sales were our primary source of income, we learned to trust God for our daily bread in very practical ways. Looking back now, I can see that every chapter of my life has been part of God's preparation for the ministry He's given me. The darkness wasn't wasted, it was transformed. The pain wasn't pointless, it was purposeful. The struggles weren't just obstacles, they were training. Today, when I speak to someone who's trapped in spiritual darkness, I can look them in the eye and say with complete honesty, I know exactly where you are, and I know there's a way out. When I counsel someone who's struggling with guilt and shame over their past, I can share my own story of forgiveness and redemption. When I teach about spiritual warfare, I'm not speaking from theory, but from experience. This is what I want to leave you with, friend. Your story isn't over. No matter what you've done, no matter where you've been, no matter how far you think you've fallen, God can take the broken pieces of your life and create something beautiful. He specializes in redemption, in transformation, in making all things new. The enemy wants you to believe that you've gone too far, that you've done too much, that God could never love someone like you. But that's the same lie he told me when I was at my lowest point. And it's just that, a lie. God's love is deeper than your darkest secret. His grace is greater than your worst failure. His power is stronger than any force that might be holding you captive. And if you're ready to let Him change your story, He's ready to begin that work right now, right where you are. All you have to do is what I did in that pastor's office all those years ago. Admit that you need help. Acknowledge that you can't save yourself. Ask Jesus to forgive you and give you a new beginning, and then trust Him to do what only He can do. Transform a life that seems hopeless into a testimony of hope for others. That's my prayer for you today, friend, that you would experience the same freedom, the same peace, the same joy that God gave me. that your story would become another testimony to His incredible power to save and transform lives. That you would discover, as I did, that no matter how dark your past, your future in Him is brighter than you can imagine. God bless you, and thank you for letting me share my heart with you today. You know, friend, as I've shared my story and traveled around speaking at churches and conferences, people often ask me about practical matters of protection and safety. They want to know how to defend themselves and their families, not just spiritually, but physically too. And I think that's a valid concern, especially for people who've been involved in dangerous situations or who are helping others escape from them. I believe strongly that everyone should learn at least basic self-defense. I'm not talking about becoming a martial arts master, but just knowing how to protect yourself with your own hands if necessary. This is especially important for women and children, who are often seen as easier targets by people with bad intentions. Over the years, I've taught many women some basic techniques: how to use everyday items like keys or pens as defensive weapons, how to strike effectively at vital points, how to create distance and escape from dangerous situations. A simple ballpoint pen can be incredibly effective if you know where to target it. Keys held properly between your fingers can give you an advantage when you need it most. The truth is, people who train in martial arts are usually less likely to get into fights, not more likely. When you understand your own capabilities and have confidence in your ability to defend yourself, you carry yourself differently. Your posture, your awareness, your whole demeanor changes in ways that potential attackers can sense. I learned this lesson personally during my years of training. I started martial arts as a teenager and found that the more skilled I became, the less I needed to prove anything to anyone. I could walk away from confrontations because I wasn't afraid. I didn't need to posture or threaten because I knew what I was capable of if truly necessary. But there were 2 occasions when I made the decision to react to armed robbery attempts, and I want to be clear, I don't recommend this to anyone. It was a different time in my life when I felt like I had nothing to lose, before I was married and had a family to think about. But both times, something inside me just couldn't accept being victimized. The first time, a man approached me with a gun, demanding my car. He was alone, which was fortunate because multiple attackers would have made resistance much more dangerous. As he stood there threatening me, I noticed he was holding the weapon incorrectly, not maintaining proper distance, getting too comfortable with what he thought was complete control of the situation. I waited for the right moment, when his attention wavered slightly and I moved to disarm him. In the struggle, the gun discharged into the air. It turned out he had it cocked and ready to fire, which I hadn't realized. But by God's grace, no one was hurt. My fiancée Christina was nearby, and my first concern was making sure she was safe. Once I had control of the weapon, the would-be robber ran away. I tried to fire the remaining bullets, thinking they might be evidence, but none of them discharged. Later I realized the ammunition must have been old or damaged by moisture. What could have been a tragedy became a testimony to God's protection. I gave the gun to a police officer friend of mine to avoid the bureaucratic complications of having to explain to investigators how I came to possess someone else's weapon. It was simpler that way, and I knew my friend would handle it properly. The second incident was similar. Another attempted car theft that I chose to resist rather than comply with. Again, God protected me and I was able to turn the tables on the attacker. But looking back now, I realize how foolish I was being. One small mistake, one moment of bad timing, and I could have been killed, leaving Christina widowed before we were even married. These experiences reinforced my belief that people should be prepared to defend themselves, but also that such situations should be avoided whenever possible. The best self-defense is awareness, staying out of dangerous places, being alert to your surroundings, not making yourself an easy target. This is why I believe so strongly in martial arts training, especially for children. It's not just about fighting techniques, though those are important. It's about discipline, respect, hierarchy, focus, and most importantly, confidence. When a child learns martial arts properly, they develop a bearing and self-assurance that makes them less likely to be targeted by bullies or predators. In traditional martial arts, you learn to respect your instructors, your fellow students, and the training space itself. You bow when entering and leaving the dojo. You follow protocols and show deference to those with more experience and higher rank. These aren't just empty rituals. They're teaching respect, humility, and self-control. A person who is trained seriously in martial arts carries themselves differently. Their posture is straighter, their awareness is heightened, their movements are more controlled and purposeful. Predators, like animals in the wild, look for easy prey. They're not going to choose the gazelle that looks strong and alert when there are weaker, more vulnerable targets available. For women especially, I recommend carrying legal defensive tools like pepper spray. You can buy these at most sporting goods stores and shooting clubs. While they're not as strong as what police use, they're still effective enough to temporarily disable an attacker and give you time to escape. The key is knowing how to use them properly and having the mental preparation to actually deploy them when necessary. I also think women should consider carrying small, legal defensive tools like tactical pens or personal alarms. But whatever you choose to carry, you must be trained in its use and mentally prepared to actually use it. There's no point in having a defensive weapon if you're going to hesitate when your life is in danger. This brings me to something I've observed through my martial arts training and my years of ministry: the importance of mental preparation. In my Kung Fu training, we spent a lot of time on meditation and visualization. We would mentally rehearse techniques, including their most violent applications. For example, when learning a joint manipulation that could break someone's arm, we would meditate on that action, visualizing the bone actually breaking, hearing the sound it would make, seeing the injury that would result. This wasn't sadistic. It was psychological preparation for the reality of what we might have to do to protect ourselves. The human mind naturally hesitates before causing serious harm to another person, even in self-defense. That hesitation can get you killed. By mentally rehearsing these actions ahead of time, we were training ourselves to follow through completely if the situation demanded it. We progressed through different stages of training. First was meditation, mentally preparing for violent action. Then concentration, learning to focus completely on the task at hand, blocking out distractions. Finally, contemplation, reaching a state where your body simply reacts automatically without conscious thought. It's like when someone throws something at you unexpectedly and you automatically catch it or duck out of the way. You don't think about it, your body just responds. That's the level of preparation serious martial artists achieve: instinctive, immediate response to threats. I remember my master making us repeat individual techniques hundreds of times until they became completely automatic. Your muscles develop memory through repetition. In a real confrontation, you don't have time to think about which technique to use or how to execute it properly. You just react. This level of preparation serves people well in many areas of life, not just physical confrontations. The discipline, focus, and confidence that come from serious martial arts training benefit you in your career, your relationships, your spiritual life. It's training for life, not just for fighting. All of this connects back to my testimony and the ministry God has given me. When you've experienced real spiritual warfare, when you've faced genuine evil and supernatural forces, you understand that preparation is essential in every area of life. Physical preparation, mental preparation, and most importantly, spiritual preparation. The same principles apply whether you're facing a human attacker or spiritual opposition. You need to know your capabilities, understand your authority, be mentally prepared to act decisively, and trust in God's protection and power working through you. Speaking of preparation and long-term commitment, let me tell you about my publishing journey, because it illustrates how God can take something that starts small and build it into something much larger over time. My first book, Son of Fire, was published back in 1999, and at the time I had no idea it would lead to writing more than 20 books over the next 2 decades. That first publishing experience was a real leap of faith, requiring me to invest money I didn't really have and trust that God would provide readers for the message He had given me. But that book's success opened doors I never expected. Other publishers began approaching me, recognizing that there was an audience for the kind of content I was producing. Eventually, I signed with Planeta, which at the time was the 7th largest publishing house in the world and definitely the biggest in Brazil, competing only with giants like Penguin Random House. Working with Planeta was incredible. They gave my books the kind of professional treatment that independent authors can only dream of. Major bookstore placement, promotional campaigns, even launches at book fairs like the São Paulo Book Biennial. Seeing my work displayed alongside best-selling authors was surreal and humbling at the same time. The validation of having major publishers invest in my work confirmed that God was using my testimony in ways I couldn't have imagined when I first started writing. My books began reaching audiences far beyond the Christian market, finding readers who might never have walked into a church but were willing to read an honest account of spiritual transformation. When the pandemic hit and everything moved online, the publishing landscape changed dramatically. That's when Arcadia Publishers approached me with a proposal to improve the production quality of my books even further. They specialized in high-end publishing with superior paper, professional graphics, and artistic elements that elevated the reading experience. The Dimitri Chronicles series, which I mentioned earlier, became particularly successful under their guidance. These 4 books, which blend spiritual warfare themes with compelling storytelling, have found readers around the world. The first volume actually reached #1 on Amazon's bestseller list and stayed there for 3 weeks, outselling even Stephen King during that period. That was an incredible feeling, seeing my work ranked ahead of authors I had admired for years. At various times, my books have outperformed bestsellers like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and other well-known titles. It's not about competition, really, but about confirmation that the message God gave me to share is reaching the people who need to hear it. The research required for historical fiction like the Dimitri series is intensive. These stories are set in the 1950s, which means every detail, clothing, technology, social attitudes, historical events, has to be accurate to that time period. I spend months researching before I write a single word of narrative. For the 3rd volume, I used Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Kentucky as the backdrop. This location is considered one of the most haunted places in the world, and its history is genuinely disturbing. Originally built as a tuberculosis treatment facility, more than 60,000 people died there during the decades when tuberculosis had no cure. Using real locations and historical events as the foundation for fictional stories allows me to explore spiritual themes in ways that feel authentic and grounded. Readers can visit these places, research the history for themselves, and understand that while the characters and specific events in my novels are fictional, the spiritual realities they represent are very real. I'm currently working on the 4th and final volume of the Dimitri series, which will complete the story arc I began several years ago. After that, I have ideas for other projects, but I'm learning to take things one book at a time and let God direct the process. The success of my books has also opened opportunities for other forms of ministry: speaking engagements, television interviews, counseling opportunities with people dealing with occult involvement or spiritual oppression. It's all connected, really. The books create a platform for broader ministry, and the ministry experiences provide material for future books. What amazes me most is how God has taken the darkest period of my life and transformed it into the foundation for everything meaningful I've accomplished since. The years I spent in spiritual darkness weren't wasted. They were preparation for the ministry He had planned for me all along. Every person I've been able to help escape from occult involvement, every family I've been able to counsel through spiritual crisis, every reader who has found hope through my testimony, none of that would have been possible without my own journey through darkness into light. That's the mystery of God's redemption, friend. He doesn't just rescue us from our mistakes and failures. He transforms them into tools for rescuing others. He takes what the enemy meant for evil and turns it into something good, something that brings glory to His name and hope to people who desperately need it. And that transformation is available to everyone, regardless of how far they've fallen or how much they've lost. If God can take someone like me, someone who was as deep in spiritual darkness as it's possible to go, and turn my life into a testimony of His grace and power, then He can do the same for anyone. The key is being willing to surrender everything to Him, to let Him not just forgive your past, but transform it into something useful for His kingdom. That's the difference between forgiveness and redemption. Forgiveness wipes the slate clean, but redemption takes the broken pieces and creates something beautiful from them. That's my prayer for anyone reading this, that they would experience not just God's forgiveness, but His complete redemption of their story. That they would discover, as I have, that no matter how dark their past, their future in Him is brighter than they can imagine. You know, friend, there's something I need to share with you that I've been hesitant to talk about because it's the most painful part of my story. But I believe God wants me to be completely honest with you, even about the hardest chapters of this journey. First, let me explain something about my name. When you see Daniel Mistral on my books, that's actually a pen name I adopted after my conversion. My real name is Michael, but when I became a Christian, the people who were discipling me told me that God was giving me a new name, just like He did with Jacob, who became Israel, or Saul who became Paul. They said God had chosen the name Daniel for me, which means God is my judge. And Mastral, well, that was my own creation. I come from Italian ancestry, the Mastrangelo family from Calabria, so I adapted that into Mastral. I checked the phone book to make sure there weren't any other Daniel Mastrals around who might get confused with my work. For many years, I wrote my books together with my wife. Her name was Christina, but she also used a pen name, Isabella. We always wrote as a team, Isabella and Daniel Mastral. She brought a feminine perspective to our stories that I could never have provided on my own. When I needed to write from a female character's viewpoint, she would craft those sections with such skill and insight. Christina was a brilliant friend. She had graduated from the University of São Paulo Medical School and specialized in infectious diseases. She had worked at the Hospital das Clínicas, one of the most demanding medical environments in Brazil. But you remember how I told you earlier about what happened after her father's death? How someone in the family said those thoughtless words about what good it was to have a doctor in the family if she couldn't save her own father. Those words created such a deep wound in her spirit that she never really recovered professionally. She had all this medical knowledge, all this training, but she couldn't bring herself to practice medicine anymore. Instead, she poured that same care and attention into our writing, especially when our stories involved medical situations or procedures. We had been married for many wonderful years when God blessed us with a son. We adopted him, and he became the light of our lives. Christina called me sweetheart, and I called her darling. But our son, he called me Papa, and brought such joy into our home. But friend, life has a way of testing your faith in ways you never expect. When our son was about 7 years old, he started showing signs of something we didn't understand at first. He began having episodes of deep sadness and anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere. One day he came to me and hugged me tight. We had such a close relationship, he and I. But when he pulled away, I noticed his arm was bleeding. He had been cutting himself, friend. Such a young child, dealing with pain so deep that he thought hurting his body would somehow make the emotional pain go away. Papa, he said to me, I need help. I'm not okay. My heart broke for him in that moment. Here was this precious child, this gift from God, struggling with something I had never experienced myself. Christina recognized the signs immediately. It was what they call borderline personality disorder, something she herself had struggled with earlier in life, but had learned to manage. I want to be clear about something, friend. I've always believed in balancing spiritual truth with practical wisdom. I never told my son that everything was caused by spiritual forces, or that all he needed was prayer. No, we prayed with him and for him, but we also took him to psychiatrists and therapists. We got him the medical help he needed. You see, I believe God has given us doctors and medicine as tools for healing. Faith and medicine aren't opposites. They're partners in God's plan for restoration. So we pursued both spiritual and medical help for our son. For several months, it seemed like we were making progress. He was seeing therapists, taking medication, and we thought we had found stability. But then one day, while I was out having lunch with my publisher, Christina called me. She spoke very calmly, trying not to alarm me since I was driving. Michael, she said, our son isn't doing well. You need to come home. We might need to take him to the hospital. When I got home, I found Christina performing CPR on our boy. She was checking his pulse, giving him rescue breaths, monitoring his blood pressure, all her medical training kicking in to keep our son alive. He had taken an overdose of his medications during one of his dark episodes. Thanks to Christina's quick action and medical knowledge, our son survived that crisis. But it was clear that he needed more intensive care than we could provide at home. We had to make the heartbreaking decision to have him admitted to a psychiatric facility where he could receive round-the-clock supervision and treatment. Our son was incredibly intelligent and self-aware for such a young child. During his time in treatment, he wrote in a journal, documenting his thoughts and feelings, trying to understand what was happening in his own mind. Reading those entries later was both heartbreaking and inspiring, seeing how hard he was fighting to get better, how much he wanted to overcome the darkness that seemed to cloud his thoughts. We established a routine where Christina and I would take turns staying with him, watching over him 24 hours a day. I stopped working, stopped traveling for speaking engagements, stopped everything except caring for our son. Nothing else mattered except helping him fight this battle. He had good days and bad days. Sometimes he seemed like his old self, laughing, playing, talking about his dreams for the future. Other times, the depression would descend like a heavy blanket, and we could see him struggling just to make it through each hour. The first symptoms appeared on May 2nd, 2018. For months, we fought alongside him, using every resource we could find: medical, psychological, spiritual. Christina's medical background was invaluable during this time. She understood his condition in ways I couldn't, could interpret his symptoms and medication effects with professional insight. But friend, sometimes God's timeline isn't our timeline. Sometimes his plans don't match our desperate prayers. On December 22nd, 2018, after 8 months and 20 days of fighting this battle, our precious son went to be with Jesus. He was just 8 years and 10 days old. The grief was indescribable. How do you make sense of losing a child? How do you reconcile your faith in God's goodness with such devastating loss? Christina and I clung to each other and to our faith, but the questions were overwhelming. Christina threw herself into caring for me during my grief, working through the night sometimes just to make sure I was okay, to make sure I wasn't slipping into my own darkness. She had lost a child too, but she was more concerned about how I was handling the loss than about processing her own grief. Then, exactly 1 year later, on December 22nd, 2019, I woke up to find that Christina had passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had worked through the night as usual, checking on me, making sure everything was in order, and then she simply didn't wake up. The doctor said her heart had just stopped. No pain, no struggle, no illness. She went to sleep and woke up in heaven, reunited with our son. In some ways, friend, I believe that's exactly how she would have wanted it. Quick, peaceful, without the deterioration and suffering that comes with long illness. But for me, left here alone, the grief was overwhelming. In the span of 13 months, I had lost the two people I loved most in this world. My son, my wife, my family, gone. There were moments when I questioned everything. Was this somehow related to my past involvement in dark forces? Was this punishment for writing about spiritual warfare? Had I somehow brought this pain upon my family by sharing my testimony publicly? But then I remembered what I had learned in that pastor's office so many years ago, that God's love is bigger than our circumstances, that his plans are higher than our understanding, and that even in our deepest grief, he is working all things together for good. I realized that my wife and son were now free from all the pain and struggle they had faced here.